The champagne flute slipped from Sarah's trembling fingers, crystal shattering against the marble floor of the Hamptons estate, as she watched her fiancé Marcus rehearse his vows one final time. But something was wrong, terribly, impossibly wrong. Instead of saying Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, the words that tumbled from his lips were Charlotte and Morrison. Charlotte, her dead sister's name. Marcus. Sarah's voice cracked like autumn leaves. What did you just say? Marcus looked up from his handwritten notes, his steel-gray eyes distant and cold in a way that made Sarah's blood freeze. For a moment, he seemed almost surprised to see her standing there in the doorway of the study, still wearing her rehearsal dinner dress, mascara streaking down her cheeks. Nothing, darling. Just practicing. His smile was perfectly practiced, the same one that had charmed investors into pouring millions into his tech empire. But Sarah had seen that smile before, in boardroom footage where he'd destroyed competitors without blinking. The wedding was tomorrow. 300 guests. The media calling it the wedding of the decade. Sarah Morrison, small-town teacher turned nonprofit director, marrying Marcus Blackwood, the youngest tech billionaire on the East Coast. The fairy tale, they said. If only they knew fairy tales were just nightmares dressed in pretty gowns. Sarah had met Marcus 18 months ago at a charity gala for children's literacy, her cause, funded by his foundation. He'd approached her at the silent auction, where she'd been bidding on a weekend getaway she couldn't afford, using her deceased parents' inheritance money. You know, he'd said, appearing beside her like smoke, I could buy that trip for you and 10 others like it without checking my account balance. She'd turned, ready to deliver a sharp retort about privilege and assumptions, but the words died in her throat. Marcus Blackwood was devastatingly handsome in the way that money could perfect. Sharp jawline, perfectly styled dark hair, a suit that probably cost more than her annual salary. But it was his eyes that caught her. They looked lonely. I don't need rescuing, she'd replied. Neither do I, he'd said, and something in his voice made her believe him. But maybe we could not need rescuing together. It had been the most romantic 18 months of her life. Private jets to Paris for weekend getaways. Front row seats at Broadway shows. Shopping sprees that left her dizzy with their excess. Marcus showered her with attention and affection, making her feel like the most precious thing in his meticulously controlled world. But there were signs. Small things that nagged at her like splinters under the skin. The way Marcus never wanted to talk about her family, especially Charlotte. How he'd grown distant whenever Sarah mentioned her sister's memory or the foundation she'd started in Charlotte's name. The locked room in his penthouse that he claimed was just storage. The phone calls he'd take in hushed tones, always stepping away when she entered the room. And then there were the photos. Last month, while looking for a phone charger in Marcus's desk, Sarah had discovered a manila envelope tucked behind his laptop. Inside were dozens of photographs of Charlotte, professional shots that looked like they'd been taken by a private investigator. Charlotte at her job at the art gallery. Charlotte laughing with friends at a coffee shop. Charlotte in her apartment taken through the window. The photos were dated just 3 months before Charlotte's car accident. When Sarah confronted Marcus about them, his explanation had been smooth as aged whiskey. I wanted to understand your family better, darling. I hired someone to research your background, standard procedure for someone in my position. I was being thorough. It had made sense at the time. Rich people did background checks on everyone, didn't they? But now, standing in his study as he practiced saying her dead sister's name instead of hers, Sarah felt the walls of her perfect fairy tale crumbling around her. Marcus, she whispered, stepping closer to his mahogany desk. Why did you say Charlotte's name? His fingers stilled on the papers. When he looked up, his expression was unreadable. You're imagining things, Sarah. Pre-wedding jitters. Perfectly normal. But Sarah wasn't imagining the way his voice had caressed Charlotte's name with a tenderness she'd never heard him use with hers. She wasn't imagining the photos or the locked room, or the way he'd insisted on planning every detail of their wedding himself. Down to her dress, her flowers, her vows. Her vows that he'd written for her. I want to see what you wrote, she said, reaching for the papers on his desk. Marcus's hand slammed down on them with surprising force. Sarah, you're being ridiculous. Go get some rest. Tomorrow is our big day. But Sarah had spent 3 years teaching middle school before switching to nonprofit work. She knew when someone was lying to her. She could see it in the tension around Marcus's eyes, the way his jaw clenched, the slight tremor in his perfectly manicured hands. Move your hand, Marcus. Sarah, move your hand. For a moment, they stared at each other across the expanse of his desk. The poor girl from nowhere and the man who owned everything. Then Marcus slowly lifted his palm. Sarah grabbed the papers and stepped back, her heart hammering against her ribs as she read. The vows were beautiful, poetic even. Declarations of eternal love and devotion. But they weren't for her. Every single reference was to Charlotte. Charlotte's smile. Charlotte's kindness. Charlotte's dreams of traveling the world. Charlotte's love for impressionist paintings. Something Sarah had never mentioned because she preferred modern art. What is this? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Marcus stood slowly, his 6-foot frame towering over her. It's complicated. Complicated. Sarah's voice rose to a shriek. You wrote wedding vows to my dead sister, the sister who died 2 years ago in a car accident. Charlotte didn't die in a car accident. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. The papers scattered from her numb fingers, floating to the floor like dying wishes. What did you just say? Marcus walked around the desk with predatory grace, and for the first time in 18 months, Sarah felt afraid of him. Charlotte didn't die in that accident, Sarah. She survived. Barely. She's been in a private medical facility in Switzerland, recovering from traumatic brain injuries. Sarah's legs gave out. She gripped the back of a leather chair, her knuckles white against the dark material. That's impossible. I went to her funeral. I buried her. You buried an empty casket. Marcus's voice was eerily calm. I made sure of that. The room spun around Sarah like a carnival ride gone wrong. Made sure of what? Marcus, what are you talking about? I was in love with Charlotte, Sarah. Obsessively, completely in love with her. I met her 6 months before I met you, at the same gallery where she worked. I pursued her relentlessly, but she kept turning me down. Said I was too intense, too controlling. Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. She had no idea how right she was. Sarah felt bile rise in her throat. The photos in your desk. I had her followed for months. I learned everything about her. Her favorite coffee order, her route to work, her friends, her family. Especially her family. Her sister Sarah, who looked so much like her it was uncanny. You're sick. Sarah backed toward the door, but Marcus moved faster, blocking her path. I'm persistent. When Charlotte continued to reject me, I decided to take a different approach. If I couldn't have her, maybe I could have the next best thing. Sarah's world tilted on its axis. You orchestrated her accident. I orchestrated her disappearance. The accident was meant to look fatal, but Charlotte was supposed to survive. She was supposed to wake up with selective amnesia, and I would be there to help her rebuild her life. As my wife. But she didn't wake up the way you wanted. Marcus's perfect facade cracked, revealing something dark and desperate underneath. The brain injuries were more severe than anticipated. She woke up, but she wasn't Charlotte anymore. Not completely. She has the mind of a child in some ways. She remembers fragments. Her art, her love for sunflowers, her childhood. But she doesn't remember rejecting me. Sarah's hand found the doorknob behind her. So you kept her prisoner. I kept her safe, in the best facility money could buy, with the best doctors, the best care. And she's happy, Sarah. She paints all day and talks about the man who visits her. The man who brings her sunflowers and tells her they're going to have a beautiful wedding someday. You've been visiting her. Sarah's voice was hollow with horror. You've been pretending to be her fiancé. She loves me now. Finally, completely loves me. But there's a problem. Marcus stepped closer, and Sarah could smell his expensive cologne mixed with something sharper. Desperation. The doctors say she's improving. Her memories might come back. She might remember who she really is, who I really am. Sarah's hand twisted the doorknob, but it didn't budge. Locked. That's where you come in, darling. Marcus's endearment felt like poison on her skin. You're going to become Charlotte. You're going to take her place in the world while she lives safely in Switzerland as my beloved patient. And no one will ever know the difference. You're insane. Sarah's voice was barely a breath. I'm thorough. Tomorrow, when I say I do to Charlotte and Morrison, I'll be marrying the woman I've always loved. Just in the wrong body. Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out a syringe filled with clear liquid. Don't worry. When you wake up, you'll be Charlotte too. Same facility, same doctors. They're very good at creating selective amnesia. Sarah's survival instincts kicked in like lightning. She grabbed the heavy crystal paperweight from the table beside the door and hurled it at Marcus's head. He ducked, but it caught him on the shoulder, sending him stumbling backward. The syringe skittered across the floor. Sarah fumbled with the door lock, her fingers shaking so hard she could barely turn the mechanism. Behind her, she could hear Marcus cursing, struggling to his feet. The lock clicked. Sarah ran. She burst through the front door of the estate into the cool October night, her designer heels clicking against the cobblestone driveway. Behind her, she could hear Marcus shouting her name, or was it Charlotte's? Her car keys were still inside, along with her purse, her phone, everything. But the catering van was parked near the garden entrance, engine still running as workers unloaded tomorrow's wedding feast. Sarah dove into the driver's seat and slammed the van into drive, gravel spraying as she tore down the winding driveway. In the rearview mirror, she could see Marcus standing in the doorway, his silhouette dark against the golden light of his perfect home. She drove straight to the police station, her rehearsal dinner dress torn and dirty, her hair wild with panic. The desk sergeant looked skeptical as she babbled about kidnapping and staged deaths and Swiss medical facilities. But when she mentioned Marcus Blackwood's name, everything changed. Detective Maria Santos took her statement with the kind of quiet intensity that spoke of years dealing with wealthy men who thought money could buy them anything, including people. We'll need proof, Detective Santos said. The medical facility records, financial transactions, anything that connects Blackwood to your sister's supposed death. The locked room, Sarah whispered. In his penthouse. He said it was storage, but I bet that's where he keeps everything. It took 18 hours to get the warrant. 18 hours of Sarah hiding in a safe house while Marcus's lawyers descended like vultures, claiming she was having a nervous breakdown, that she was making wild accusations to get out of marriage to a man she'd realized she didn't love. But when the search warrant was executed, they found everything. The locked room was a shrine to Charlotte. Hundreds more photographs, detailed surveillance reports, medical records from the Swiss facility, financial payments to the doctors who had helped fake Charlotte's death. And in a hidden safe behind Charlotte's portrait, they found videos. Videos of Charlotte in her hospital room, painting with childlike wonder while Marcus sat beside her, reading her love letters he'd written to himself. Videos of him proposing to her with a ring she'd accepted with vacant, trusting eyes. Videos of him practicing wedding vows, the same vows he'd planned to say to Sarah. The media called it the crime of the century. The tech billionaire who'd kidnapped the woman he loved and replaced her with her identical twin sister. The wedding that never happened became front-page news around the world. Marcus Blackwood was arrested and charged with kidnapping, fraud, conspiracy, and a dozen other crimes. His lawyers claimed temporary insanity brought on by obsessive love disorder. The jury wasn't buying it. But the most important discovery came 3 days after Marcus's arrest, when Swiss authorities raided the medical facility. Charlotte was alive, exactly as Marcus had said. Fragile, confused, but alive. Sarah stood outside Charlotte's hospital room, watching through the window as her sister painted sunflowers on a small canvas. Charlotte looked exactly as she had 2 years ago, as if time had stopped the day of the accident. Her dark hair fell in waves around her shoulders, and her green eyes, Sarah's eyes, were focused intently on her work. The doctors said Charlotte's memories were returning slowly. She'd already asked about Sarah several times, confused about why her sister hadn't visited in so long. She doesn't remember him, Dr. Mitchell explained. Not the real him, anyway. Her mind created a protective fantasy around the trauma. She remembers a kind man who brought her flowers, but not the obsession, not the kidnapping. It may be a blessing. Sarah pressed her palm against the cool glass. Can I see her? Soon. We want to prepare her first, help her understand what happened. It will be traumatic to learn the truth about the last 2 years. As Sarah watched, Charlotte looked up from her painting and smiled. The same warm, genuine smile that had lit up every room she'd ever entered. For a moment, their eyes met through the glass, and Sarah saw a flicker of recognition. Charlotte pressed her paint-stained hand against the window, perfectly aligned with Sarah's palm on the other side. The trial lasted 4 months. Marcus Blackwood was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge called his crimes a calculated and grotesque violation of human dignity and autonomy. Sarah testified on the final day, her voice steady as she described the 18 months of lies, the gradual realization that she'd never been more than a substitute for the woman Marcus truly wanted. He didn't love me, she told the packed courtroom. He loved the idea of owning someone who couldn't say no. He loved control more than he loved anything else. Marcus sat at the defendant's table, his expensive suit replaced with prison orange, his perfect hair grown out and unkempt. When the verdict was read, he showed no emotion. But as they led him away in shackles, he turned and looked directly at Sarah. "Charlotte," he mouthed silently. Even then, even after everything, he couldn't see her as anyone but a pale reflection of her sister. 6 months after the trial, Sarah opened the Charlotte Morrison Foundation for Missing Persons. A real foundation this time, funded by the settlement from Marcus's seized assets. She and Charlotte worked together, Charlotte's artistic talents channeled into creating awareness campaigns for families of missing loved ones. Charlotte's memory had returned almost completely, though she chose not to remember the details of her captivity. "Some doors are better left closed," she told Sarah one afternoon as they painted together in their shared studio. The media eventually moved on to other scandals, other crimes. But sometimes, late at night, Sarah would find herself checking the locks on her doors twice, looking over her shoulder on empty streets, wondering if there were other Marcus Blackwoods out there. Men who saw love as ownership and women as interchangeable dolls in their private collections. She'd learned that fairy tales weren't just nightmares in pretty dresses. Sometimes they were nightmares that walked among us in expensive suits, hiding behind charitable foundations and romantic gestures, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal their true nature. But she'd also learned that some stories, no matter how dark they began, could still find their way to something resembling light. The wedding dress Sarah never wore still hung in her closet, a white ghost of the life she'd almost lost. Sometimes she caught Charlotte looking at it with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Do you ever wonder," Charlotte asked one day, "what would have happened if you'd married him? If you'd gone through with it?" Sarah shuddered, remembering the syringe, the locked room, the way Marcus had practiced saying Charlotte's name with such twisted devotion. "I try not to think about it." But late at night, when sleep eluded her, Sarah couldn't help but wonder about the other women who might be out there. Women who said yes to charming billionaires. Women who ignored the red flags. Women who walked down aisles toward men who saw them as nothing more than beautiful, breathing dolls. The wedding that never happened had saved 2 lives. But somewhere in the darkness, Sarah knew there were other weddings taking place. Other vows being exchanged. Other women disappearing into lives that looked like fairy tales from the outside. And sometimes, in her darkest moments, she wondered if they'd been the lucky ones. The question that haunted her most wasn't what Marcus had planned to do to her. It was simpler and more terrifying. How many other Charlottes were still out there, painting sunflowers in hidden rooms, waiting for someone to find them?